Now, I mean, Isabel, there's this US general a few days ago saying the UK was no longer a major military power. Now we hear this. It's from an expert at the Royal United Services Institute. It kind of stings, doesn't it, from the point of view of national pride, if you've always rather enjoyed being seen as a global power?
Yeah, and it particularly stings Conservative MPs who do pride themselves as being the party of defence and who are perpetually anxious that their party in government isn't spending enough on defence, isn't giving enough of its commitments to NATO, particularly at the moment. And there is this really interesting sort of guerrilla campaign, I guess, being waged by Ben Wallace, who is making the case in every way he possibly can, pushing, I'd say, the boundaries of cabinet collective responsibility for maintaining or raising defence spending the next budget. I don't get the impression that he and Jeremy Hunt are close enough for him to do this face-to-face, or at least they don't get on well enough for him to do face-to-face, because he is, I mean, barely a day goes by without him either doing a broadcast round or giving an interview to a newspaper where he makes clear that defence spending has to rise or else. Yeah. We're not entirely clear what the or else is yet, because he said that he won't resign if it doesn't go up.
I mean, Gaby, this is not an area that Jeremy Hunt can neglect, surely. I know that he's being incredibly tight with the national purse strings just at the moment, but the party of national defence at a time of war on mainland Europe, with an enormous strategic emphasis also on China as a potential adversary, and more than just a potential adversary in a lot of people's minds, Hunt cannot just afford to ignore what Ben Wallace is saying.
No, this is the flip side of what we were just talking about when we were discussing Ukraine. I mean, we may not have troops in combat, but we are equipping and training, an army in theatre. It's just the Ukrainian army rather than ours. It's a different kind of engaging in a war, but we are to some extent engaged, and that is expensive. So that comes with commitments, that comes with full commitments. On the other hand, the kind of the sums that Ben Wallace is asking for, and I laughed to myself when Isabel said it was a guerrilla campaign. He's not a lot of crawling through the undergrowth going on here. It's more sort of charging over the horizon in a tank, running over the treasury. But yes, it is kind of, he's making it very obvious. But the sums he's asking for, £10 billion over 2 years. Well, yeah. Other cabinet ministers are not doing it so publicly, but actually the NHS would quite like some money, and I'm sure education would, and I'm sure transport would, and I'm sure local government, I'm sure everybody is making those kind of demands of Jeremy Hunt. It's just that they're not making them quite so publicly, and he can't say yes to everyone. So it's unclear. I think we've been for some time trading off an image of ourselves as a world power, an image that without sort of, it's been a bit all fur coat and no knickers. We haven't sort of stumped up the money to pay for it, and yes. I think that is now becoming obvious. We've really got to. I mean,
we're now hearing talk almost daily, aren't we, guys? Isabel, about the British military being hollowed out. It's been said very recently that if there were to be a land war, Britain was fully engaged. We could not, as a country, field an armoured division. Now, those sorts of things, as we say, rather sting. And it was part of the picture of Brexit, that Britain would be this global Britain, this strategic power. And that part of the argument here appears to be being rather undermined, Isabel.
A few years ago, I remember writing a column where Conservative MPs come to me complaining that Philip Hammond, who was at the time the Foreign Secretary, had dismissed their calls at that moment for more defence spending, saying there's no votes in defence. And they were obviously absolutely furious about this. And there was a denial from Philip Hammond's team saying they hadn't heard the comments, or they didn't recognise the comments, which is sort of a way of saying that they did happen. But it was really interesting because there is this tension between the Conservative sort of, I suppose, sense of duty and desire to have a place in the world for Britain, and the raw calculation, which is that voters are going to get much more worked up about NHS spending,
yes.
About tanks and army, MOD procurement and so on, and that's the real problem that Jeremy Hunt is having in the Treasury. And as an ex-health secretary, he's under huge pressure to give the NHS more money, left, right, and centre.
Yes.
particularly in terms of pay deals. So there are a lot of very difficult trade-offs here.
In crude electoral terms, then, Gabby, I wonder if that old argument, there aren't votes in dissent in defence, still hold true, because Labour can close the gap, they can build on their credentials, they can show they've shaken off the baggage of the Corbyn years. Hard to overtake the Tories on this issue, though, isn't it?
Yes, I think all Labour wants to do is just neutralise that argument to make sure it's not a sort of a real weakness for them, something that they can be constantly sort of attacked over. So I don't think they're going to try and outflank the Tories on defence spending. It'd be extremely hard to, or outflank the Tories in defence policy. I think they're just going to try and make sure that they're not, left behind.
Mind you as well, on the gossip level, it's been interesting today to hear the suggestion of Ben Wallace maybe fancying the job of being the next General Secretary General of NATO, and how that might be a little bit tougher if he's seen by NATO colleagues to be losing out in this fight for more defence spending.
Yeah, we had another dinar there, didn't we, from him on whether he wanted to go for that job.
I think did he deny it completely? Did he not say, let's see how it goes, or words to that effect?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, exactly. It leaves open the possibility he might just fancy. He was talked about, wasn't he, Gabby, in the very recent past as a potential, more than once actually, as a potential runner for Prime Minister. He did not take that bait on NATO. You can somehow see it.
I think you can. And I think the calculation for Ben Wallace would have to be, he was, as you say, talked up a lot. He decided not to run. And I don't think, you don't see Ben Wallace as a cabinet minister who would be moved around to other departments. It's not like, 6 months' time, he could be promoted to health secretary or something, or he's going to be, he has made defence his own. But I think there's only so far you can go in that field. And the NATO job might look very appealing, particularly when you think that by next year you might not be in government. Actually, NATO would look like it. And suppose you were to be interested in that job, it's never a bad idea to look like you're really, really very keen for your country to live up to its NATO commitments. It's very important to NATO that NATO members spend enough on defence that NATO can actually do its job. So that would not be a bad dress rehearsal for the NATO job at all.
And bringing the conversation back, Isabel, as it were, full circle. And if we agree, and I think we do, for Labour the job is not to be too far behind. It's difficult to overtake the Tories. That doesn't mean it's not a big issue, because war in Ukraine, worries about China, questions of Britain's role in the world. These do prey somewhere at the back of a lot of people's minds. Both parties have to put up a good fight, a good game on this now.
Yeah, and Labour has been working really hard on making sure that it is, I think, robust on defence, not least because it's had the blip, as it would like to characterise them, of the Corbyn years. So there is an arms race between the two parties, I think, again on this, whereas previously the Tories could dismiss Labour as being soft on defence. You now have Keir Starmer's party trying to be tough and to talk about higher spending and talk about its unshakable commitment to NATO and so on to completely change that dynamic.